We are sitting at the Wilson Center, the former memorial to Wilson. I know some friends here have grown tired over the years of hearing my spiel. I guess I need to find a different way to say that he was our 28th president and the only president to have a PhD. And so Congress set up a memorial to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together. I'm not exactly sure how I will vary that, but nevertheless, it bears repeating that we're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing, which is bringing together analysis and researchers and practitioners on the environmental change and security program. We've been around since 1994, trying to understand population health, environment issues in the context of development, foreign, and security policy. And like so many of our sessions here at the center, we have the good fortune to be supported by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, currently under our HELPS project, Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security Project. So as you could see, and as I mentioned this morning, we're about integrating these topics and trying to understand them together. So with that introduction, Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Can everyone hear? Yeah. Good. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for plugging the book. The great thing about having a book is that if you get embarrassing questions sometimes, you can dodge them. You can just say, read chapter 8 or chapter 7.
Right. You say, buy the book and then read
buy
it.
the
Right.
book. The topic I was given, Yemen's governance challenges, it's like being asked to speak about islands in Greece or art in Italy or maybe affairs in France. You have an embarrassment of riches. But the organizers have very wisely limited me to 20 minutes, so there'll be a limit to the amount of pain I will impose upon you. What I'd like to do is to look first at kind of the slow motion revolution that is going on now, and then think ahead a little bit about what comes after that revolution, or the next phase of that revolution, and then talk a little bit about the challenges of institutionalizing reform in Yemen. Moving beyond Ali Abdullah Saleh has proven to be very challenging. Challenging not only for the Yemeni people, but challenging for the neighboring countries and challenging for the international community as a whole. And if we get there, it's still if, it's only because there's going to be a concerted effort of all of those parties that are concerned, interested, and involved. The Yemenis themselves, their neighbors, and the international community. And I should add here that Jim McVeary, the State Department coordinator for Yemen, has just shared with me the Reuters report that they hope to have a signing of an agreement this evening in Sana'a, insha'Allah. But what have been the components of that concerted effort? Well, certainly the most important part has been the internal revolution in Yemen itself. And I think the interesting thing there is that Yemen's political progress was really at an impasse and in many ways going backwards in January of this year when the law was proposed to the parliament to extend the presidential term. And the revolution, thanks to Tunisia, thanks to Egypt, the revolution interposed in here and once again started some momentum for change. And that's, as we all know, because of not so much the formal opposition, but rather the new civil society taking to the streets and finding a voice and finding ways of impacting the political establishment there. And I don't think I need to talk too much to this group about the intricacies involved here. I would just want to point out a lot of times in the superficial coverage. They talk about the regime, they talk about the opposition, and I think, as we know, that's a simplification that really misleads us, because the opposition is not unified, and you can break it down in many different ways, but I like to think of it in terms of the formal opposition, the political parties that have been long-standing, and then the informal opposition, which has arose out of this phenomenon. And what happens to these different oppositions as this moves forward is going to be very, very important. They don't always agree, those two oppositions. They don't agree on the question of accountability for President Saleh and his family and the government, and that's going to be an important issue. They don't agree on power sharing and how this new force, this new political force, gets institutionalized in Yemen. And I think that is the first big challenge that I would highlight. How do you capture this energy, this potential, and inject it into the Yemeni political system for the longer term, so that it is not lost, and that as Yemen moves forward, that kind of criticism, questioning, values get a voice and get a role in what comes ahead. The internal dynamic, however, proved insufficient to resolve the crisis in Yemen. It was not, as in Tunisia or in Egypt, that it alone sufficed. And therefore, I think we had the very welcome phenomenon of the neighbors of Yemen, the Gulf Cooperation Council, becoming active and playing what I think is a positive role. This is a new phenomenon, I believe. The GCC has not, in the past, been inclined to take political initiatives like this. They've not been that inclined to deal seriously with Yemen. They've preferred, I think, to put Yemen aside and just occupy themselves with this royalist club that they have. But in this case, they've taken another track, and I think that they have made a positive contribution. We've seen a lot of games playing in this negotiating process. I think President Saleh did not disappoint us in that he was very hard to pin down and coming up with lots of maneuvers. This is a standard operating procedure. But the challenge here is to concert sufficient forces so the president, in the end, does the right thing, and hopefully that's what we will be seeing. Included in those forces, I think, very significantly, in addition to those internal forces that we've already talked about a little bit, is Saudi Arabia and the attitude of Saudi Arabia towards this problem and towards Yemen. And I see, I believe, a greater seriousness on the part of Saudi Arabia, not only in terms of participating in the GCC initiative, but really bringing effective pressure to bear on Yemen, both in terms of interventions with President Saleh and the question of resources going or not going to Yemen. In Yemen, this is how people keep score, and it matters whether you put your money where your mouth is. And I think we're seeing Saudi Arabia and others do that. So this whole phenomenon of the neighbors taking more and more responsibility for Yemen, I think, is positive, needs to be encouraged, and can go much further into realms beyond the political, but rather economic and development. And then I think there's the international efforts. that are necessary. And I know our ambassador has been very active in this. I know the European ambassadors have been active. And I think they played a constructive role. And I think it's a legitimate role. I know this is a sensitive point for my Yemeni friends who prefer to say, hands off, leave us alone, we'll sort out our own issues. But I think Yemen is different than either Egypt or Tunisia in this regard. And this is why. In Yemen, you have this organization, Al-Qaeda, which has made very, very clear that it aims to attack not only Yemeni interests, but neighboring interests, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. homeland. So leaders of these other countries don't have the luxury of saying this is a purely Yemeni affair. They have to identify where their national interests are, and then they have to come up with a legitimate and an effective way of protecting those interests. And so that is also in play here. And I think that the international community, too, has made a contribution. And if you look in recent days, the way Saleh and his government has been turning towards the ambassadors, the American ambassadors, the European ambassadors, obviously seeking to retain legitimacy. There is influence that can be brought to bear in this regard and for a positive effect. Okay, let's suppose there's an agreement signed, inshallah. Then you get a whole new series of risks, because you only have to think back to the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians or the Dayton Accords with in the Balkans to know that an agreement is the first step, and that often in these situations it's much more difficult to implement than it is to reach the agreement. So have a break to celebrate, but then the next day it's very important for all of these forces to get back to work on the question of implementation. And just as it took concerted pressure to reach an agreement, so it will take concerted pressure to implement any agreement. And so this nexus has to be continued and focused effectively. As they do this, I hope that there will be a greater recognition and a greater priority to protecting what has worked in Yemen. Yemen is not a basket case. Yemen has institutions that are worth protecting. And I think the one I would like to cite up front is something like the Social Fund and Minister Al-Arhabi, a best practice internationally in terms of development. It would be a great shame that as part of this revolutionary process, what was good in Yemen gets tossed out with what was bad in Yemen. I would also argue, and this is more controversial, I would argue that something like the Central Security Forces, although they've been misused recently, still is a very necessary institution and one that has to be protected if other challenges in Yemen are to be met. So let's appreciate, identify, protect what is worthwhile. Now, it seems to me that in this next period, there are two challenges worth focusing on related to implementation. One of them is going to be the elections that are mandated by the agreement. And there's not a long fuse for this. Happily, Yemenis have a good history of elections. There's a lot of experience there. The 2003 elections, I saw personally and was impressed. The 2006 elections also had very positive points to them. But after 2006, I think you had backsliding and you had, to some extent, a dismantling of the electoral system. And this needs to be corrected. The Supreme Committee on Elections and Referenda has to be made legitimate again. The voting lists, which have been neglected, have to be dealt with. And there's not going to be a lot of time to do this before the mandated elections. And yet, again, if this process is going to succeed at the end of those elections, the majority of Yemenis have to look and say, yes, those were relatively free and fair. And the international community has to be able to look at those and say, yes, those were relatively free and fair. Now, as I said, the Yemenis are going to take the lead on this. They have experience. They've done a good job in the past. There is certainly a role for international help in this regard. And the institutions are well known, institutions like National Democratic Institute, institutions like IFES, institutions like UNDP. It would be my hope that Yemenis would be seeking the assistance of these institutions and that these institutions would be gearing up to provide that help to the maximum. The last point I would like to make is the point on institutionalizing the reform. How do you handle these emerging political forces so as to protect them and inject them into the political system? I don't think the agreement does that very well, because I don't think the agreement has provisions for bringing them, and I think it's pretty much a deal between the ruling party and the opposition parties. Part of the challenge is that the emerging forces themselves aren't very well organized, and it's hard for them to put forward a leadership that can be incorporated. But let me throw out some ideas that might be useful to keep in mind as they proceed. One idea is let youth vote. If you update the electoral rolls, and if you bring this huge number of young people into the political system and give them that political voice, you will be changing the political dynamic in Yemen, and you will be creating a possibility for younger voices to have greater weight. And so that simple process is important, and then organization of that vote is important. Number two, I would say protect the social network system. And I don't presume to know how to do that, but I do argue that the revolutionaries in Sana'a and elsewhere in Yemen know what part of social networks have been important to them, and they're in a position to articulate that value and to call for it to be protected as things move forward. So the ability to organize is not impaired. Protect NGOs in Yemen. It's an NGO-rich environment, more so in my experience than a place like Egypt, which is in some ways more sophisticated. So NGOs are a vital part of the civil society. They should be protected politically and legally. I would argue free up and protect the media. In the post-election period in Egypt, we have seen the Egyptian media playing a much more important role. And you only have to be in Washington and pick up the Washington Post to see that how critical it is, even in a place like the U.S., when it comes to your local government, when it comes to those congressmen up on the Hill, when it comes to the bureaucrats. Unless you have some media keeping a spotlight on these powerful people, abuses are going to accumulate. And to my mind, this has got to be a priority as they move forward. I think simple, basic things like publicizing budgets, hydrocarbon revenues, getting this information out, making it a legal requirement. Don't just set up a situation where you get a national unity government new people come in, they very quickly create their own vested interest, and this kind of information is once again hidden from the population, and the new people in the chairs have a chance to play with it. I would say this is the time to clearly establish precedents and legal requirements in that regard. I think, in a way, the American Bill of Rights is not a bad model. To identify specific things that made the revolution succeed and then find some way of expressing them and getting them adopted by the body politic as sacrosanct to preserve the gains that are there. And in conclusion, I would say this whole process, this whole revolutionary process that's going on in Yemen is a transformative process. And you have the iron hot. It is a mistake to over-focus on the end of a regime. Yes, it's important to get a transfer of power, but I would argue equally important is to institutionalize the forces that have led to this as a safeguard against the counter-revolution and as an impetus to meeting those many, many political challenges that Yemen faces.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Experienced diplomats know how to, when they say they're going to speak for 20 minutes, down to literally the second speaking for 20 minutes. It's a skill that I always marvel at. Thank you, sir, for that wide-ranging and in-depth suggestion practically where we need to focus in this transition. Why don't we open the floor up for discussion? Obviously, there are lots of different angles that we could take on your remarks and also draw on your extensive experience. Why don't we start right down here in the front? Again, if you can wait for a microphone so our folks online can hear your question. It's coming to you.
I had just a quick point of clarification. When, Ambassador, when you spoke about the revolutionary groups or how to institutionalize them, who were you speaking of? I mean, are you speaking of the Shabab, or are you talking about the Houthi, or are you talking about the Southerners? I mean,
I was speaking mostly about the protesters and the people in the streets of Sana'a and the other city, the people who have found a voice in this revolution. And it's interesting, I think, that it's not just kind of the outsiders, because as I listen to Yemenis talk, I also hear people in official positions espousing fairly revolutionary ideas. So in a way, the ambassador is smiling and nodding. So it's not just the people in Change Square. I would say it's the people who want a different Yemen and want a civil society that has a greater voice in that new Yemen.
Ambassador, we'll get you a microphone here in just 1 second.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hall. I don't know where to start. You have really condensed this matter very, very well. But you have also the main issues there. I only have to comment on few things. One is the issue of institutions that need to be preserved. I think there we need to distinguish between institutions and persons, because the issue has also been addressed by the young people. You know, if you follow their what they write, what they say, they, for example, if you talk about the national security, they still agree that there should be a national security apparatus there in place, not to be dismantled like what they wanted at the beginning, but they talk about who should lead this. You know, they need change of persons leading that that institution. The second issue that I need to maybe bring to more focus is there is still a majority of people who are concerned about what you precisely said about having three groups in play. There is the regime, there is the opposition, and there is the young people out in the street. And the only thing that really groups them together is that they want the regime to go. So they know exactly what they don't want, but they don't know what they want afterwards. This is really what makes a majority of the silent majority, let me say, still not taking sides, because this is a big, big concern. Still a very big concern. The risks after are really huge, you know, and some of the people who have, what you say here, if you cannot beat them, join them. You know, some of the people who were really targeted by the young people have joined the revolutionaries. So, and they are really, they're known to be corrupt, they're known to be, and so on and so forth. They were the objective of the revolution is to get rid of them. They have joined the revolution. And everybody is silent about them because they think they can use them and then they can drop them later on. And I don't think they can drop them later on easily. There will still be a huge problem afterwards just to get rid of these jumpers, that came in. That's all. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I would say on changing the people, not just the institutions, or protecting the institutions, but changing the people. That point. Obviously, there needs to be greater change than just the president. There has to be a broader accountability than that. Otherwise, it just becomes a symbolic. My argument is this. In my dealings with the Yemeni government, I experienced many world-class people in terms of their intellects, in terms of their dedication to their jobs, in terms of their effectiveness. I would hate to see that talent denied Yemen as it goes forward simply because of the fact that they were part of this government. My experience, I've served in U.S. governments where I didn't necessarily agree with what was happening in the White House or some of the decisions that were made in the White House. And yet, we find ways of doing our duty and maintaining a modicum of integrity. I think that there are many people in the Yemeni government in a similar situation, and I don't think a clean sweep is in Yemen's interest, given the talent in question. On the second point, the revolutionaries, you got to go beyond getting rid of the president, and you've got to come up with a positive agenda if you're going to impact the future. I would suggest a couple of things. I think focusing on how those elections are going to be organized and run, how the voters lists are going to be updated. A lot of energy can be put on that. If it's done right, it's going to have long-term significance. It's also going to have significance in terms of what happens after the transitional government. So I would hope that this political energy, some of it can be directed in that way. And then I think there are some kind of relatively simple objectives that could be agreed upon even in a fractious opposition. Something like term limits, that a president or a prime minister, however it turns out, should serve maybe 2 terms, but never again, president for life or president for 32 years. But of course, it's for the Yemeni people to decide for themselves what's important in this regard. I would just say come up with something and don't let the energy dissipate and risk being ignored in the longer-term process.
Could I throw in a couple questions to the mix and ask you about your insights and reflection on how best the U.S. can organize itself to be supportive? And I guess that in 2 ways. One of the things that you suggested that that it was important to find ways to protect what was a rich and vibrant NGO community, and certainly a common development model practiced by AID is to work directly with those NGOs. And so your reflections on the kind of the common development question of working with the state and working with the NGOs and how one finds an optimal balance between those models, which in fact we even have within the government, the kind of MCC versus USAID models of how to do that. And then in the larger context, what would be your advice in terms of the optimal mix among the 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development? Clearly, we have assistance programs under or in efforts under all 3 of those. Often they don't necessarily intertwine, or there are arguments, at least back in Washington, about how they shouldn't intertwine. But your sense of how those different strands go forward and are or are not integrated for maximal effectiveness, given what you see as the priorities.
Okay, on the U.S. role, I think first it needs to remain engaged in implementation as much or more than it has been engaged in the negotiating process. I think there may be greater scope in the implementation because of our experience with Yemen on such things as elections and the tools we have in that regard, tools like NDI. USAID, of course, has a lot of governance experience. So we've got tools that are relevant. We've got an experience that's relevant. There's going to be a crying need for it. And I think we've got to gear up to do it. I don't think that normally the State Department has adequate resources to do this. I'm pretty sure Embassy Sana'a does not have adequate resources to do this. And it would be missing a great opportunity if we didn't, one way or the other, come up with the resources needed to play a full role in supporting it. Again, U.S. doesn't have to do it alone. Europeans have capabilities. I saw when the NDI brought in observer teams. There are lots of countries around the world who have experience with these situations. There's a lot of expertise out there, and it needs to be brought to bear. In terms of, I think there's another role here, and this is going to be uncomfortable for some people. What could throw this off the rails? Well, I'll tell you what, one thing that could throw this off the rails would be a dramatic success by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Europe, in the United States, in Saudi Arabia. You would get tremendous pressure to take action, and people wouldn't be too careful when it comes to sovereignty and other important things. There should be a concerted effort, very much in Yemen's interest, very much in the international community's interest, to forestall that development. There should be an increased effort to reverse a negative trend and counter that increasing operating space that AQAP has gained in this period. I know it's not at the top of a lot of people's agenda, but it is very important. It is a game changer, and you ought to anticipate it and head it off if at all possible. NGOs versus the state. It's easier to work with NGOs in Yemen than the state, in my experience. But if you don't get the Ministry of Health doing what it's supposed to do, how do you keep those clinics and hospitals staffed and equipped? So there's a temptation to go to the NGO community, but I think it's one you have to resist, and you have to build capacity in the government as well. So yeah, you got to do it both. Defense, development, diplomacy. We got plenty of defense. Don't worry about that. That's going to be taken care of. You'll also have plenty of intelligence. You didn't mention that. That's not in the initials, but it's there, and you'll get plenty of that. We don't have enough diplomacy. Our diplomatic presence in Sana'a is not adequate. It doesn't begin to be adequate. The ambassador is being asked to do things to make bricks without straw. And you can come up with reasons why this is true. You can talk about Iraq. You can talk about Afghanistan. I don't care. There's no, to me, valid excuse, given the stakes, given that Washington has acknowledged that the most serious operational threat to the U.S. homeland is from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There is no excuse for having an understaffed, under-resourced embassy in that country at this time. Absolutely no excuse. So that needs to be done. And then development, wow. We only had to listen to this morning's sessions to know that however many development resources you dedicate to Yemen, it's not going to be enough. And it's just a question of, I think, convincing the Congress and the American people that the development dollars are well spent in Yemen, because there's a competition for them, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. And what I think the Yemenis have to realize is that this can't be a one-way street. The United States certainly, but I would argue other international donors will not flow resources where they are not well used. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the Yemenis have to accept the responsibility for reasonable reforms, for effective use of these resources. And my argument has always been that when you can show results, then you can ask for additional resources.
Well, I know we have some more questions, but we also have the other session, and we're running behind, not because of the ambassador, but we meant to, given how we wanted to give you a chance to eat, in short. So we've taken the time for that. We have run over. I think what I propose that we do is we take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for our final panel. I know there's some other questions for the ambassador. I'd encourage you to come up and engage in the conversation during the break. I want to thank you very much for a rich discussion and a terrific luncheon session. Really appreciate you sharing the insights. And again, the book information is out on the table. I urge you all to pick that up as well. So join me in thanking you.